All right, good day, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Give me just one moment as I share my screen here real quick. Can I get a thumbs up from somebody if you can see my copy of the ISO standard here?
We can see it.
Okay, thank you. I am going to be looking at my desktop here, so if anybody has a question, if you could come off mute and ask it, because I won't be able to see the chat as we're going through. I'm breaking up section 7 into two different pieces. Part of that is because of the size of the scope of this element of the standard, but also because there is in my opinion, a very natural kind of break point in section 7 that I think makes a good stopping point for discussion or conversation. Also, it kind of prevents this training from being 90 minutes to 2 hours as we try and cover all of section 7. There is, even though section 7 is one of the larger sections of the ISO regulation, I still feel that it is somewhat deceptive in how it makes some of these activities seem incredibly simple in the way that they are described in the standard, when in fact it's describing some very complicated concepts. And so I'm going to do my best to try and highlight some of those areas where I think it is, expressing something as being incredibly simple when in fact it's not. We'll kick things off. You're going to see that as we go through section 7, we're going to continue the theme that we had in sections 5 and 6, in that we are building upon things that we discussed in preceding sections of the ISO standard, and I will try to call out those things as well. As we get into planning of product realization, I want to first start off by calling back to the very beginning of the ISO standard and revisiting what it considers to be the definition of product. As we read through it, we have a tendency to think of product as the finished good or the product that is leaving the facility. But the definition in the ISO standard of a product is, in very simple terms, it is the result of a process. So product can exist at multiple levels of your organization. Any individual manufacturing process that you have in your facility generates a product. It might not be the finished product, but it is the product or the output of that process. And then the sum total of all of the processes within your manufacturing facility represent the finished product or the output of your total manufacturing process. And that might go to a sterilization facility. It might go directly to a customer. It might go to another third-party service provider. So as we're going through the standard and it is referring to the term product, just keep in mind that that can mean a couple of different things depending on the context of what you're working on. So as we start off, the regulation says that the organization shall, again, always focusing in on the shalls, you will plan and develop processes needed for product realization, and that the planning of product realization has to be consistent with the requirements of your quality management system. So if you recall that the purpose of the quality management system is to ensure that we can meet customer specifications and that we can comply with regulatory requirements, we build a quality management system to accomplish those two things. Our plans and procedures for product realization have to align with meeting customer specifications and satisfying regulatory requirements. So as you're building out that plan, it has to capture those two things. That is kind of the top level shall of product planning of product realization. There's also an element here that talks about risk management. I'll try and highlight it with my cursor right here. So this is kind of the tie-in from what was historically ISO 14971. We're starting to tie in some risk management elements into the ISO 1345 standard. So the organization shall document the processes for risk management in product realization and keep records of that risk management. So it wants to understand a couple of things. At what point in the planning and product realization process are you doing risk-based assessments Are you evaluating the risk of the product and the risk of the manufacturing process? And how is that driving activity in your planning and product realization? How do the risk management activities inform the work that you're going to do? So we're going to step through here to the next section. In planning product realization, organization shall. Here are the shalls. We are going to have quality objectives and requirements specifically for the product. Quality objectives, when we think about them in the context of the quality management system as a whole, but also with regards to product specific, quality objectives can be things that are very simple, like metrics. We might measure the yield of a manufacturing line. We might measure the number of nonconformances that are generated by a manufacturing line or a manufacturing process. We might have business targets that we're trying to hit as well. But there are a lot of things that can be considered quality objectives as it pertains to product. And then, do you have any specifications that are clearly defined for the product? Because those can be considered quality objectives as well. There is a need to establish processes and documents. So again, this is kind of a callback to section 4, where your quality system has a structure to it that captures processes and the documentation associated with that planning and realization. And you have to provide resources. Those resources include, let me see if I can grab them here, resources specific to infrastructure and work environment. So that is a callback to, what was it, section 6 that we just covered that talked about infrastructure, work environment, and resources. Resources, again, also meaning human resources and people. And then the organization will have verification, validation, monitoring, measuring, inspection, and test, handling, storage. All of those elements that you see there in section C, those are going to be covered in the subsequent elements of the ISO standard. So up until this point, we've kind of been calling back to things that we talked about before. Item C here is the first time that we're kind of pointing forward to things that we've not yet covered, but all of those things will be covered in the remainder of the ISO standard. And then again, as always, we're required to have records to provide evidence that we followed our process and that the product meets requirements and specifications. Again, underlying purpose of the quality management system is to demonstrate that we meet customer specifications and regulatory requirements. So here in the meat of the ISO standard, where we're getting ready to start making product, we need to have documentation that supports that we met those two primary objectives of the quality management system. And the output of all of this planning that we're going to do is documented in a form that is suitable for the method of operations within the organization. And that's kind of a broad statement that allows you to kind of break up. So you could think about it in this context. That kind of is a blanket statement that allows you to do things like sub-assemblies, and the way that we structure the manufacturing processes leading up to the finished good. We can kind of capture that in smaller chunks or different elements if it makes sense for the method of operations in the organization. When you see this note here, further information can be found in ISO 14971. That is kind of a callback to this statement up here around risk management. If you'll recall, I said that this requirement ultimately comes from the 14971 standard, much of which has been kind of incorporated into 1345. So that's what that note is referencing there. All of that is to kind of discuss the top level structure of product planning and realization. In the same way that section 4 kind of describes the overall structure of the quality management system itself, section 7.1 is talking about the need for a structure that defines your product planning and realization. Any questions about 7.1 before we move on to 7.2? Okay, customer-related processes. So here what we're talking about is, again, focusing on the organization shalls. You shall have requirements that are specified by the customer. Again, that's a callback to the purpose of the quality management system that we talked about in the introduction and the scope. That includes delivery and post-delivery activities. The requirements that are not specified by the customer but are necessary for its intended use need to be known and captured as part of these requirements. So for us, As a contract manufacturer, this has a little bit of a different connotation. So if you think about the ISO standard written from the context of an OEM, their customer is different from the context that we would think about a customer. So for us as a contract manufacturer, some requirements that may not be stated by the customer but are necessary, let me talk about what that might mean. So for us, our customer is an OEM, and many of you have experienced, whether it's through a design and development project or whether it's through a design transfer or a new product launch, that frequently the customer does not fully define or document every single specification. And sometimes this is because they don't fully know all of the specifications, especially in a new program launch. Frequently in a new program launch, especially in the early launch days, we are identifying new failure modes and new risks that previously neither us nor the OEM customer even knew existed, or that there was a potential for those types of failures. So that's one reason why they might not be specified. But another reason why they might not be specified is there might be requirements for us as the contract manufacturer that are specific to the manufacturing process that are not necessarily linked to the product itself, but things that would be important to us from a manufacturing standpoint that we need to define within our quality system, even though it's not a requirement that is delivered to us specifically from the customer. So another set of requirements that are related to the product are the regulatory requirements, again, calling back to the purpose of the quality management system, and then any user training that is needed to ensure specified performance and safe use of the medical device. So this kind of calls back to the resources section. If you'll recall, when we talked about resources, it talked about the competency of personnel, and that if personnel didn't have the requisite skills, you had to be willing to provide those in a reasonable period of time. So this user training is talking about if you're introducing a new product and that new product, either by the intended use of it or some other factor, requires additional skills on behalf of the people manufacturing the product, you have to provide that to them. But it's also talking about user training. So again, think of this in the context of our OEM partners, and their customer might be a physician or a hospital or something of that nature. So if there is additional user training that is needed in order for the hospital to be able to use this device, then the plan for that training and the development of that training needs to be documented as part of this process in the ISO standard as well. And then any additional requirements that are determined by the organization, those might be business requirements that are determined by our organization as a contract manufacturer, or in the context of an OEM, it might be additional requirements that have something to do with, business targets, marketing targets, or geographies that you intend to sell the product, because geographies outside of the EU and other targeted countries might have additional regulatory requirements that wouldn't be captured by the ISO 13485 standard and might require additional manufacturing documentation. 7.2.2 is the review of requirements related to the product. So the organization shall review these requirements, and these requirements have to be reviewed prior to your commitment to supply product to the customer. So for us as a contract manufacturer, a lot of times where we capture this activity in our organization is in contract review. So you might have a procedure in your quality management system that is specifically titled contract review. It might be if you have a set of design control procedures in your facility, sometimes it's captured under the design control suite of documents. But ultimately, or in other contexts, sometimes it gets buried in your purchase order review procedure. But fundamentally, what we're trying to understand through these requirements review is the customer has outlined all of these requirements that you have to meet as part of this delivery or this output of product realization. Can you meet all of those requirements? And prior to committing to the customer that you're going to manufacture this product for them, you have to review and verify that you can meet all of those requirements. Now, from an OEM standpoint, there's a little bit of a different context as an OEM. So you'll see their submission of tenders. If you're not familiar with what that process is, I'll try to describe it at a very high level. It's a little bit of a complicated system, but essentially tenders, what that is some countries or geographies will almost post a contract that they call a tender that says, we are looking for a quantity of X number of units of devices that can do this kind of thing. And then our OEM partners, it's kind of a bidding process where they bid on that tender and say, yes, we can provide that product to you. And then whoever wins the or is approved or given that tender after they submit their bid, they have to be able to provide that product in a very reasonable amount of time. And so one of the requirements that they're outlining here in 7.2.2 is that if you're an OEM that is going to be submitting to win some of these tender orders, you have to first review that order and verify that you can meet all of the requirements for what it is that you are bidding on. Okay, so further in the context here, you have to review and verify that the product requirements are defined and documented, that the contract order and requirements are resolved if there's some differing opinions between what you think it says and what the intent of that language is, that you can meet the regulatory requirements, that you can perform any user training that is required for your device, and that the organization as a whole can meet all of the requirements of that tender offer. Now, again, different context if you're an OEM and a contract manufacturer. For us, we're primarily focused on customer specifications and our ability to meet customer specifications. But if we can do that, then we are, as part of contract review, we're essentially meeting 7.2.2. You are supposed to document the review of that contract, and then the last bullet here, when the customer provides no statement of requirement, the customer requirements shall be confirmed by the organization before acceptance. So essentially what they're saying there is, if there's any uncertainty or if there are any elements that are critical that the customer has not provided any requirements, you need to proactively go back and ask them for those or verify whether or not they exist or if it is a critical requirement that you've uncovered. Any questions about 7.2.2? That one is one of those clauses that doesn't get a lot of attention within the quality management system. It's a fairly easy part of the regulation that if an auditor is looking for an area to find a minor or major finding for an organization, contract review along with training are kind of two areas that are pretty easy pickings for an auditor to find evidence that you're not adequately capturing and documenting the contract review. Remember, part of that clause, I'll back up just quickly and say that you have to, well, I've already lost it, but here we go. Records of the results of the review and actions arising shall be maintained. If you're not maintaining records of that contract review, you have some vulnerability there from a compliance standpoint, okay? And then this submission of tenders and contracts in the OEM world is not something that we talk about very frequently within our organization. So if there's any questions around that, I will do my best to answer them if you have questions about that. Okay, let's talk about 7.2.3, communication. So the organization, from a communication standpoint, you have to plan and document arrangements for communicating to the customer about, and again, customer has different context if you're the OEM versus a contract manufacturer, but you must be able to have a plan for communicating about product information, inquiries, contracts, and order handling, customer feedback, including complaints, and advisory notices. So this is all, think of it in this context. We're talking about communicating about things leading up to the manufacturing process and communicating about things that happen after the manufacturing process. A and B are the, kind of customer service elements of capturing an order and committing to fulfill an order. C and D are if something has gone wrong on the back end and we are getting complaints or there are field advisory notices related to the product. Customer feedback being a little bit more of a general term. Customer feedback in some contexts can include, positive feedback or accommodations from the customer. But the more frequent type of feedback that we get is through the complaint handling system. So you have to have a formalized plan for how you're going to do those things. A lot of times what I see, especially here recently, is these plans are captured in the quality agreement that we sign with the customer. Many of you don't go through the review process of quality agreements. Essentially, a quality agreement is kind of like a contract, and the context of that contract defines how the quality management system for Viant and the quality management system for the customer is going to be applied to this particular program. Kind of think of it like a racing matrix. Whose quality system is going to capture complaints? Whose quality system is going to capture the manufacturing process? In this case, we usually have a table or a matrix at the end of the quality agreement that identifies all the key contacts for a lot of these areas. And if it doesn't have a specific name, it might have a job title, or if it doesn't have a job title, sometimes, especially the larger organizations, will have an email address that, for example, complaints. If Viant becomes aware of any field complaint, they need to send an email to complaints@customeroem.com, and then that complaints email address gets distributed to a large number of people, so that as people come and go from an organization or as job titles change, you can still capture that data input. And we do similar things in some portions of our organization as well. So you have to have formal communication plans, and the reason why that is primarily, in my experience, because there are some timing elements to some of these things. So, for example, complaints, adverse event reporting for complaints, you typically have about 30 days to investigate and determine if there is a reportable event that needs to be submitted to different geographies. And in some cases, if it's a high-risk complaint, that timeline is even shorter. And you don't want to eat up elements of your timeline trying to find the appropriate contact person, either at the customer or at the contract manufacturer, to try and get answers to some of the questions relevant to the complaint investigation. So that's one of the reasons why you have to have a formal plan for communicating in regards to some of these areas. Okay, any questions about that before we move into design and development? Okay. Design and development organizations shall have documented procedures for design and development. There's a number of sites in the organization that do not have design and development procedures. In the event that you do not have the design and development procedures, because design is not a service that your particular site offers, you should have in your quality manual a statement that says that you've excluded 7.3.2. Well, specifically, we usually just talk to the high level 7.3 design and development. That's been excluded from your quality management system because it's not a service you provide. But we do have a number of sites in the organization that do offer design and development as a service. And so they have a suite of procedures that capture the design and development process. The design and development process, I'm going to talk about. Normally, we just kind of march through the regulation from top to bottom as I'm scrolling through it. But in this case, I think it's relevant and helpful to talk about what the flow of design and development is at a very high level, and then kind of go back and talk about what the specific requirements are at every step. So I'm very briefly going to go through the bolded elements here and talk to you about what each one of those things are so that you understand the overall concept of design and development, and then we'll go back and look at some of the specifics for each one of these clauses. So design and development starts with planning. You're going to plan the specifications and the product, what it is that is needed, and the process by which you will design this product, including the stage gates and the different milestone markers in your design plan. You have design and development inputs, design and development outputs, and design and development review, verification, and validation. And so I want you to think of those almost as though it was a linear timeline or a series of dots that have to be connected, okay? You have your planning dot, that is your leading dot that says, here's how we're going to lay out the plan of what we're going to do. And then you have inputs, and inputs are key, because this is where you begin to capture all of these specifications, the customer specifications. Now, if you're an OEM manufacturer, when you talk about inputs, you're usually talking about user inputs and design inputs. So frequently, OEMs will sit with a physician or a group of physicians and pitch them the concept for a device that they are planning to design and develop. And then they will capture all of the feedback from the physicians, who are the users, about what are the important elements of how this device should function, how it should look, how it should feel, usability, ergonomics, even to the extent that some organizations will define some marketing or branding requirements that factor into the design. There are, of course, a number of regulatory inputs that feed into the design. And so you're capturing design inputs from all of these different locations, right? For each one of those design inputs, you have to have a corresponding design output, which means this is the document or the element of the design that satisfies each and every one of the inputs that we have already defined. And then subsequent to the design outputs is the review, which is essentially a confirmation that all inputs have been captured in your outputs, and then comes verification and validation. So for every one of those design outputs, you either verify or validate that you have successfully satisfied that specification. So outputs can take a lot of different forms, and we'll talk about those as we kind of march through the regulation. And oftentimes the type of output that you have will then determine whether you're doing verification or validation. But you very rarely do both verification and validation, which can sometimes be a little bit misleading, because if you've ever heard a customer talk about DV and V testing, or the units that they need us to build for DVV, what they're talking about there is design verification and validation, but it's not because we're doing both. It's an either or in most cases. So we'll kind of go back and start with 7.3.2 and talk about design and development planning. Again, focusing in on the shalls, the organization shall plan and control the design and development of product. In this context, we tend to think about product as being the finished product, but remember, based on the definition, it could also be the output of an individual manufacturing process. And that this design and development plan is intended to be a living document, and that it is supposed to be updated periodically as the design progresses. So during design and development, the organization is going to have different stages. Most of the time, the stage gates for design and development are broken up into 4 or 5 categories. And those 4 or 5 categories tend to mimic these major elements of the design control procedures. So it's not uncommon for you to see the stage gates of a design process be: stage number 1 is planning, stage number 2 is design inputs, stage number 3 is outputs, and then a stage for verification and validation, and then a stage for transfer. And depending on how they break down those phases, you usually end up with 4 or 5 stage gates that are part of the design review process. When they talk about the reviews that are needed at each design and development stage, those are most commonly referred to as design reviews, and they are a very formal meeting that takes place with very specific content, a very specific agenda, and there are a series of outputs that you must deliver on the output of a design review that are intended to satisfy the requirements of this regulation. The verification, validation, and transfer activities that are appropriate at each design and development stage, as I said, they usually kind of break those out into different stages. You also have to have a plan for the responsibilities and authorities for design and development. So if you're doing design and development, you typically have a lot more regulatory affairs functions. You have a lot more clinical evaluations functions, in addition to the more common things that we encounter, things like R&D, supply chain, quality, operations, things like that. So there are some additional responsibilities and authorities that you're going to see in a design set of procedures that you might not see if you were only participating in the design transfer part of design and development procedures. And then you have to have traceability. If you'll recall, I said think about all of these elements as a line where you connect all of the dots. So you've got the plan, the inputs, the outputs, the review, verification and validation, and then transfer. It is a regulatory requirement that you be able to trace design and development outputs to their respective design and development inputs. Remember, I said you have to be able to show that you have an output that corresponds to every input so that you have fully satisfied the design input requirements. This traceability is usually done in the form of a matrix. If you've ever heard of a design inputs requirements document, sometimes it's referred to as a DIRD, sometimes it's referred to as a user requirements document, but essentially it's a matrix. It looks very much like a control plan or almost like an FMEA, where you have all of the design inputs listed down on the y-axis, and then as you go across the x-axis, you connect each input to an output, And then either the method of verification or validation, right? Whether it's going to be part of your control plan, whether it's a validation strategy, and you reference the validation report. But you have to be able to connect the dots for each one of those things. And at the end of your design reviews, you have to be able to show that you've captured all of your design inputs effectively. And then, of course, you have to have the appropriate resources and necessary competence in order to execute all those things. So this is an area where, if you don't have clinical expertise on your team, then it can be challenging to demonstrate that you have the appropriate competence of personnel from a medical training and education background to be able to make final decisions about some of the elements related to your product design. So small organizations typically will contract this work out. They will consult with a physician in order to satisfy this requirement, and then that physician signs off on documents for the organization. Some organizations just have a doctor on staff that handles some of these things. There are other elements outside of clinical evaluation that require a very specific set of expertise that is needed, but it's probably not worth getting into the details of all those here. That's probably the most common one that you would encounter working with our OEM partners. So as we talk about design and development inputs, this is where, it really is somewhat of an oversimplification of what it is that we're talking about here. And I'll point to some very specific language to illustrate my point. So for design and development inputs, you have inputs relating to product requirements that are determined by the customer, and this is where we start to create specifications, right? And specifications is a very key word here that really opens up a broad spectrum of things that could apply to design inputs. Specifications could be product specifications, it could be sterility specifications, packaging specifications, shelf life, clinical efficacy, biocompatibility. There is an endless list of specifications that are captured as part of design inputs, and they fall under some of these categories like regulatory requirements, which drives things like clinical trials and biocompatibility. There are also regulatory requirements for electronic devices around the IEC 60601 standards. So this one concept of beginning to define specifications is really when the business of design and development explodes into a very large and complicated business. And it's one that, again, seems very simple as you're reading through the ISO standard, but in practice is incredibly complicated. And it's why you see these procedures that define the design and development controls tend to be very large and extensive procedures, especially in the planning process. You see, when you see procedures for design and development planning, there are these incredibly long and complicated checklists that the sites have to go through to ensure that all of these different inputs that we talked about that feed inputs into the design, that we have effectively and appropriately captured all of the inputs from all the various streams that then populate the overall design and development plan. So in just reading, A through E as the requirements for design inputs, just understand that is a very simple way of describing a very large amount of information that has to be distilled by the design and development team. So the ones that we tend to think about as contract manufacturers is captured in A, right? It's the functional and performance requirements of the device. Also included in that for the OEM is usability and safety. That's kind of where we live from a contract manufacturing standpoint, but is just the tip of the iceberg for our sites that do design and development. There's the applicable regulatory standards, which is a very large spectrum of inputs. And then you have the applicable outputs of risk management. So when we were doing the planning and product realization, and we were doing our risk assessments and building risk management into our process, how does that feed into your design inputs? There's also a cyclical nature to the product life cycle management. So if you think about a medical device as a product that has its own life cycle, at the very end of the process, or as we kind of come back around the circle after manufacturing and after product has been in the field, when you take that customer feedback or customer complaints data, or maybe even your non-conformance data, there is all of the risk management activity that takes place there. around identifying new failure modes or updating risk management documents. All of those activities within product lifecycle feed back into your design as a design input. So if you've ever worked on a complaint investigation where product that we manufactured failed in the field, and we worked with our OEM partners, and the result of our root cause investigation was that it was a design flaw, and the customer decided to make a design change, that process of implementing a design change in reaction to something that happened in the field is that loop back of risk management documentation back into the design of the product right here in 7.3.3C, where your risk management program and feeds back into the design in the form of a design change in that particular instance. It could also be a function of you have a product family and you know that you've got 5 other devices like this and they experience certain types of failures, and you take that risk management documentation and feed it into the design of the new device. You also have to capture as appropriate information derived from previous or similar designs, and then other requirements essential for the design and development of the product and the processes. So this might be things that are specific to the type of manufacturing processes that are going to be important to the design. So for example, you might have some design inputs that you have to document and account for because you know that a specific component is going to be injection molded, or you know that it's going to be sonic welded. And so you have to build in some design inputs for some of those manufacturing processes. Okay. Hopefully, as I rambled about that for 10 minutes, you're starting to understand that design and development inputs is deceptively simple, and that there is an incredible amount of background that goes into the inputs capture as you are developing a design. And it's far more than the customer specifications and engineering drawings that we get as a contract manufacturer. There's a lot more that goes into it than that. Any requirements need to be complete and unambiguous. So as part of the review of the inputs, the organization has to make sure that they clarify anything that's not fully fleshed out in terms of a specification, to make sure, because again, if the whole purpose of this process is that for every input we have an output, if we have an input that's not very clear and we're not sure what an output or a deliverable would be to satisfy that requirement, then we have to further clarify what that design input is. Questions about design inputs before we go into outputs? I'm trying to kind of keep things moving so that we can get to the break point before our hour is up. But this is kind of a good place to stop for questions if anybody has questions. Okay. Outputs is going to be a little bit more of an easier conversation. I want to call your attention to a few things. Remember that for every design input, we have to have a corresponding design output. So what does that output need to have? Well, we need to be able to demonstrate, we shall be able to demonstrate that we can meet the input requirements one for the design and development process, and that our outputs provide enough information for the purchasing department, for the production department, and the service department to be able to perform their activities. So if one of our inputs is that we need a component, a molded component that does X, then our output needs to be an engineering drawing for that molded component and identify a raw material so that our purchasing department can then go out and try and find or source that component for us. We also have to be able to define acceptance criteria for our design outputs so that we know whatever the input was, we have successfully met that requirement. And it also feeds into our verification and validation activities, right? Whatever acceptance criteria we define here in design and development outputs is the acceptance criteria that we're going to have to meet in our verification and validation activities. And then we have to talk about the characteristics of the product that are essential for safe and proper use that are part of the development outputs, making sure that things like usability and efficacy of the device, that we have the appropriate outputs that capture all of those things. Records, again, always calling back to section 4 that talks about the need to establish records within your quality system. So if there was a key concept or two key concepts that I would point to here is that, again, have a one-to-one for your outputs to inputs. Make sure that you're establishing acceptance criteria and know that that acceptance criteria is going to inform all of your verification and validation activities. So the design and development review, This is what I was talking about, where you have those stage gate review meetings that have very specific requirements. They happen at the different phases of the design process. So the planning process, inputs, outputs, verification, and validation. These things, these reviews have to have a very specific set of attendees. You have to have the appropriate personnel. Frequently, it's all the functional areas that approve a lot of the design documentation. Your intent in these meetings is to show that you have satisfied all of the design requirements up through that stage before moving on to the next stage. In reality, many design stages happen in parallel. So we might still be defining the design inputs for a certain part of the device that we're going to be manufacturing while we are in the process of identifying design outputs for other metal components or molded components, or we might already be purchasing equipment that is going to be used as part of the manufacturing process. It's all kind of happening in parallel. So a lot of times what we'll do in design reviews is we will kind of break it down and say, here are the elements of the design that have already satisfied everything up through, call it design inputs. And here are the elements that are still undergoing design inputs. So we're going to give conditional approval for these activities to continue into design outputs, but we're going to hold the design at design inputs until these elements over here catch up to where we're at. And so as much as the regulation kind of makes it look like this is a, we all march together through the design process, in reality, it is much more fluid and much more dynamic, as I'm sure our design and development sites will attest to. And you frequently will have multiple elements of a design in different stages of the process. And both the FDA and notified bodies understand and accept this. But what they ask is that your formal documentation and your design approvals are kind of limited by whatever your trailing or your lagging activities are. So for example, you can never fully close out inputs until everything is through inputs, and you can never formally close out outputs until everything is through outputs, even though you may have some subsets that have moved on beyond that. Verification and validation, I'm going to kind of lump them together because the requirements for both, as far as the standard is concerned, are very similar. There's just a little bit of a conceptual difference that is also the same difference that we draw the distinction in the FDA language as well. So design and development verification and validation is performed in accordance with planned and documented arrangements. What does that mean? It means that you have a protocol. We're going to have a protocol that defines how we're going to verify or validate a specific set of inputs and outputs as it relates to the design of the device. And we're going to document the plans, the acceptance criteria here. We're going to document the statistical techniques that we're going to use to analyze the data that we capture as part of the protocol. And we're going to document the rationale for our sample size. Those three elements of your protocol, whether it's for verification or validation, are the same. You have to identify your acceptance criteria, the statistical techniques that you're going to use to analyze the data, and the rationale for sample size. And if you'll recall, last year when we released the validation guidance document that we developed for Viant, all of those elements were captured in that validation guidance document because essentially the validation process for design development is incredibly similar to what we would do for a manufacturing process or other operational related validations. In theory, and best practice is, I'll call your attention here. In theory, you've done your process development ahead of time, and you've done some data analysis ahead of time so that you understand your data distribution before you get into verification and validation. And because you've done that, you should know if you have a normal distribution or a bimodal distribution or other ways that you have to analyze your data. And so in your protocol, you're supposed to establish how the statistical model that you're going to use to analyze your data in the protocol. Now, most of the time, we see that kind of as an after the fact activity where when we're writing the report, we look at the data that we have collected and we decide what statistical model we're going to use there. But according to the regulation, you're really supposed to have that captured as part of your protocol. We don't see too many findings around that. If we do, they're generally findings that are kind of wrapped up into a larger statistical techniques type of a finding where maybe your statistical techniques procedure is not sufficient enough. but you really need to be doing some of that work up front if and where you can. And then essentially the same requirements I'll show you here under validation, acceptance criteria, statistical techniques, and rationale for sample size are the same things that are captured as part of verification and validation. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about changes. And I think the big thing to note about changes is that whenever you make a change to a design, and I'm going to come back to transfer here in a moment, whenever you make changes to a design, all of the work that you did as part of the initial design, the first time you went through that process of inputs, outputs, review, verification, and validation, you essentially have to assess your design change at every step of that process along the way to understand what the impacts of that design change are going to be. So design changes, that's one of the reasons I think why some of our customers are a little bit reticent to do design changes, because it is a massive undertaking. It is not, from our perspective, sometimes it's just a matter of making a drawing change. But from the OEM perspective, a design change is almost like a mini design project in and of itself to implement that change. After you've done all of that and you've got a final design, you've got design and development transfer, which is essentially taking everything that you've done in the design and development of the device and moving it, transferring it into manufacturing documentation that can be executed. So creating all of your work instructions, doing your process validations, and this is where most of our contract manufacturing sites begin to get involved in the process. This is part of the design and development transfer. So you have to document procedures that specifically talk about how you do the transfer of design and development outputs. And the procedures capture how you have verified that the work that you did in the design process is suitable for manufacturing before it becomes final product specifications. And we see that from time to time where a design and development team might design something that conceptually works very well, but is incredibly difficult to manufacture, especially manufacture at scale. And so one of the things that you try to capture during the 7.3.8 is, are there elements of the design that are going to make this difficult to manufacture at scale that need to be addressed either as part of the transfer process or that need to loop back to the design inputs and outputs to see if there are some changes that need to be made to the design. Okay, the last element before we stop for today is the design and development files. This is kind of the culmination of all the documentation that you did in your quality management system through the preceding phases of the design and development process. In FDA language, you typically hear this called the design history file. Historically, different organizations have referred to this as a technical file or a technical dossier. Now, more commonly, we're hearing this referred to as technical documentation, especially as organizations transfer into the EU MDR requirements for the European Union. But it's essentially the organization and structure of all the documentation that describes the design and development activities that have taken place up to this point. So that takes us through design and development. And you'll see 7.4 is purchasing. This is where we start taking all of the design work and executing it in order to manufacture product. So that's kind of the natural stopping point for our session today. The next session is going to cover 7.4 through the remainder of section 7. But we do have a few minutes. If anybody has any questions about design and development, I'll do my best to answer them. This is an area of the business that not everybody has a lot of direct experience with, unless you're working at one of the design and development sites. So if we have questions, we can address those now. No questions. I've, in 50 minutes, made everybody experts at design controls. Okay. If you think of questions, please feel free to reach out to me via Teams or email or otherwise, especially because if we do get a collection of questions, it might be valuable to schedule another training session and kind of talk through some of those questions. Again, design controls is not something that all of the sites do on a routine basis. And so, I would suspect that there's probably a lot of learnings that we can capture there. And for you folks that do work at the design sites, if there are key elements of your facility that you feel like we should spend more time on, or I didn't adequately cover, please, shoot me a message with that feedback as well. And we will certainly revisit this topic as necessary. The purpose of these trainings is to familiarize people with elements of the standard, especially those elements that they don't interact with on a day-to-day basis. So this is one that I'm happy to revisit multiple times if we think there's value there. So with that, I will let you go. Thank everybody for your attendance. Again, reach out to me if you have any questions. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.